On the morning of November 14, 1977, a Montana Department of Transportation safety inspector named Richard Avery drove into Copper Falls, population 340, and ended Walt Briggs's career in about 45 minutes. Walt's truck was a 1949 Federal Wrecker, Holmes 440 boom, the only recovery vehicle within 60 miles of Copper Falls in any direction. Walt had been running it for 19 years, since 1958, when he'd bought it used from a salvage yard in Missoula for $800 and spent 4 months making it right. He was 61 years old. He had pulled every stuck, flipped, and broken-down vehicle on that stretch of Montana highway for nearly 2 decades. He had never, in 19 years, left a job unfinished. Richard Avery had never been to Copper Falls before. He was based in Helena. The inspection was part of a statewide commercial vehicle compliance sweep. He walked around the Federal. He checked the brake lines. He checked the winch cable certification, which had expired 8 months earlier because the testing facility Walt used was in Missoula, and Walt had been waiting for a window to make the drive. He checked the boom certification, also expired. He found 2 marker lights non-functional. He wrote it all down. Then he took out a red placard and attached it to the Federal's windshield. Out of service. By this point, a small audience had gathered. Copper Falls was that kind of town. The hardware store owner, the postmaster, a rancher named Dale Krause who had wandered over from the diner when he saw the inspector's truck. Richard turned to Walt. Your winch cable certification is 8 months expired. Your boom certification is expired. 2 non-functional marker lights and a brake line fitting that doesn't meet current Federal spec. He said it the way men say things they say 10 times a week. This vehicle is out of service until those items are corrected and re-inspected. This is the only recovery truck in 60 miles, Walt said. His voice was even, not angry, just stating a fact. I understand that, but the regulations apply regardless. You need to contact a certified operator from Missoula or Great Falls. It's 112 miles to Missoula. I understand that, Mr. Briggs. Walt looked at him for another moment. Then he nodded once and walked back into his garage. Richard Avery picked up his clipboard. He looked at the small group watching from the edge of the lot. This vehicle doesn't meet current Federal safety standards. This county needs to budget for a properly certified recovery vehicle if it wants this service available. He paused. I'd recommend contacting the county commissioner's office. Dale Krause said something under his breath. The postmaster turned and walked back across the street. Richard got in his state truck and drove south toward the next town on his list. The Federal sat in Walt's lot with a red placard on the windshield. By nightfall, there would be 8 inches of new snow on the highway north of town, a temperature of 7 degrees, and a school bus with 23 children at the bottom of a ravine. Let me tell you about Walt Briggs, because what came after only makes sense if you understand the man Richard Avery spent 45 minutes assessing without actually seeing. Walt had come to Copper Falls in 1952, following a woman who had grown up there and wanted to go back. The woman was his wife, Nora. She died in 1969, and Walt had considered leaving, going somewhere else, starting over. He didn't leave. The highway needed him, and he knew the highway, and those 2 facts felt like enough of a reason when no better one presented itself. The highway north of Copper Falls ran 41 miles through the Cabinet Mountains, 3 significant grades, 2 mountain stream bridges, a series of switchbacks at the north end that gained 2,000 feet in 8 miles. In summer it was difficult. In winter it was something else. Walt had worked that highway for 19 years. He knew every curve, every shoulder, every place the road looked solid and wasn't, every drainage pattern that turned a manageable snowfall into a glazed surface by morning. He knew which grades collected ice first and which ones drained fast enough to stay clear. He also knew the Federal. Every inch of it, the way you know things you've rebuilt with your own hands. The brake line fitting Richard had flagged was not a failure. It was a non-standard fitting Walt had fabricated himself when the spec part was back-ordered, stronger than the factory component. The marker lights had burned out 3 days earlier, and Walt had the replacement bulbs on the shelf. The winch cable had been load-tested by Walt every month for 19 years. None of this was available to Richard Avery in 45 minutes with a clipboard. He saw what the checklist told him to see. He was not wrong about what he saw. He was simply applying a standard design for the average case to a case that was not average by a man who had no way to know the difference. Walt knew the difference. He'd known it the moment he saw the clipboard. He just didn't argue about it. The school bus left Copper Falls at 3 in the afternoon. 23 children. Carol Hensley driving, 6 years on that route, chains on the bus because she'd checked the forecast, and in the Cabinet Mountains possible snow meant chains. The snow started at 4:15. Light at first. By 5 o'clock it wasn't light. By 5:30 it was 8 inches and coming hard and 7 degrees, and what had been a difficult road was becoming something Carol Hensley had not encountered in 6 years. She was on the last switchback, the steep one, 400 feet of elevation in less than a mile, when the rear end broke loose. She did what you're supposed to do, steered into it, eased the brakes. She'd driven in snow her whole life. The road had other ideas. The bus went sideways across the switchback, caught the guardrail on the uphill side and went over. Not a long fall, the ravine at that point was about 30 feet. The bus rolled once and came to rest on its side against a stand of lodgepole pine. The trees stopped it. 23 children, Carol Hensley, all alive. Cuts, a broken arm, a concussion on the youngest, nothing fatal, not yet. But it was 7 degrees, getting colder, and the bus was on its side in a ravine 30 feet below a mountain switchback with 8 inches of snow on the road and more coming. The first call came into the Copper Falls Sheriff's Office at 5:52 p.m. Sheriff Tom Aldrich made 4 calls in 12 minutes. Missoula Emergency Services Heavy Rescue Unit on a structure fire, 2 hours minimum. State Highway Patrol, trooper responding but not equipped for recovery. Missoula Recovery Company, 2.5 hours, maybe 3 with road conditions. Great Falls, 4 hours. Tom put down the phone and looked at his deputy. We've got 23 kids in a ravine in 7-degree weather. Closest recovery truck is 2.5 hours out. The deputy said what both of them were thinking. Walt's truck. It's got a red placard on it. I know. Tom picked up the phone. Walt answered on the second ring. Tom told him what had happened, where the bus was, what the road conditions were, what the alternatives were. Walt was quiet for a moment. I'll need the placard off the windshield, Walt said, legally. Consider it off. I need it off on paper. If I'm pulling a school bus out of a ravine on a condemned truck, I need it documented that you authorized the operation as a public safety emergency. Otherwise, I've got no coverage and neither do you. Tom wrote it up in 2 minutes. Emergency authorization, signed, time-stamped. He called Walt back. It's done. Walt hung up. Richard Avery was in room 6 of the Copper Falls Motor Inn when he heard the diesel engine. He'd finished his inspections and was eating a gas station sandwich when the sound started, heavy, close, moving through town. He looked out the window. The 1949 Federal Wrecker was rolling down Main Street, Walt behind the wheel. Holmes' boom extended and rigged. Chains on all 4 wheels throwing snow as the truck built speed toward the highway north. The red placard was gone from the windshield. Richard put on his coat. He drove north behind the Federal without entirely knowing why. Professional obligation, maybe. He had condemned that vehicle and now it was operating. Or something else. The specific discomfort of a man who has done everything correctly and is watching events suggests that correct may not have been sufficient. The highway was bad. His state truck had four-wheel drive, and he was still fighting it on the grades. Ahead of him, the Federal moved steadily, 15 miles an hour on the worst sections, its chains biting into the compacted snow with the authority of something that had been doing this for a long time. He reached the switchback and pulled over at the guardrail gap where the bus had gone through. Below him, in his headlights, the bus on its side against the trees. Interior lights still on. Small faces at the windows. The Federal had pulled up ahead. Walt was already out of the cab, walking the slope with a flashlight, testing the ground. Richard got out of his truck. He stood at the guardrail and watched Walt work for 20 minutes without saying anything. Watched him rig the chain to the base of a pine tree uphill of the gap. Watched him run the winch cable down the slope to the bus, hook it to the frame at a point Richard Avery would not have chosen, and which turned out to be exactly right. He did not know what Walt Briggs knew. He stood at the guardrail and watched and was quiet, because there was nothing useful to say. The winch started at 7:23 p.m. The Holmes 440 was not a modern winch. No load limiter. No electronic overload protection. No sensor to cut power when tension exceeded a calculated threshold. A mechanical winch built in the early 1950s on the assumption that the man operating it would know when to push and when to back off, and that this knowledge was sufficient. Walt knew. The cable went tight. The school bus shifted slightly against the trees, a groan of metal, snow compressing under the frame. 7 degrees. The children inside were cold. Some of them were crying. Carol Hensley, 3 cracked ribs she didn't know about yet, was talking to them in a steady voice. The Federal's engine deepened. The bus moved. 6 inches upslope, the frame breaking free of the snow packed around it. Then another foot. Steadily now, finding the direction Walt had set, rotating slightly so the roof was coming up toward the road rather than the underside, the angle Walt had calculated when he hooked the chain. 15 feet, 20. The winch didn't waver, it didn't protect itself, it just pulled. At 28 feet, the front of the bus cleared the edge of the ravine and found the road surface. Walt eased back on the throttle. Let the bus find its own way for the last 2 feet. It came up at 7:41 p.m. on its side still, but on the road, 10 feet from the guardrail gap, on solid pavement. Tom Aldrich had the emergency door open before Walt was out of the cab. 23 children, Carol Hensley, the broken arm, the concussion, cold and scared and alive, all of them out of the ravine. Richard Avery stood at the edge of the road. He watched Tom and Pete help the children out. Watched Carol refuse assistance until every child was ahead of her. Watched Walt begin uncoupling his chain, working without hurrying, the way a man works when the job is done and there's equipment to care for. Richard walked over. Walt looked up. "The cable," Richard said. "I flagged it for expired certification." "Yes. What's its actual condition?" "I've load tested it every month for 19 years. Full rated capacity." Walt paused. "The certification is paperwork. The cable is the cable. The brake line fitting. I fabricated it myself, stronger than factory spec. The marker lights. Burned out 3 days ago. Replacements on my shelf. I was going to install them that afternoon." Richard looked at the Federal. At the Holmes boom, still extended, cable properly spooled. At the chains on the tires, correctly tensioned, correctly sized. At the truck that had just pulled a school bus out of a mountain ravine in 7 degrees weather when nothing else within 100 miles could have done it. He had condemned this truck at 10:15 in the morning for paperwork and a set of marker light bulbs. "I did my job," Richard said. "It came out more defensive than he intended." "You did," Walt said, without irony, without satisfaction, just confirming a fact. "The regulations. The regulations are what they are. They're written for the average case. This isn't an average case. It never has been." Walt finished coiling the cable and straightened up. I'm not arguing with you about the regulations. I'll get the certifications current and come see you in Helena when it's done." Richard looked at him. "The fitting you fabricated, I'd like to inspect it properly, not to cite you." He paused. "To understand whether the standard I'm applying is the right standard for this application." Walt looked at him for a moment. It was not the response he had expected. "Come by the garage tomorrow morning," Walt said. "I'll show you everything." Richard nodded. He walked back to his state truck and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine, watching Tom load children into his patrol car, watching Carol Hensley finally let Pete look at the cut above her eye. He thought about the red placard in his jacket pocket. He didn't throw it away. The placard had been correctly issued, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But he kept it in that pocket for a long time after that night. The way men keep things that have taught them something they didn't expect to learn. Walt got his certifications current the following spring. He drove to Missoula, had the cable tested, had the boom inspected, replaced the marker lights and the brake line fitting with spec components. Not because his fabricated fitting was inferior, but because he understood that Richard Avery needed something he could put on a form. Richard came to the garage as he'd said he would. He spent a morning with Walt. He looked at the fabricated fitting, understood what it was, and wrote a note in his inspection file that his supervisor in Helena found unusual enough to ask about. Walt ran the Federal for 11 more years, until 1988, when he was 72 and his hands had started to shake on cold mornings, and he decided that shaking hands and recovery work were not a combination he was willing to test. The 1949 Federal Wrecker is still running in Montana. Different owner now, a collector in Billings who uses it for heavy work on his ranch and takes it to vintage equipment shows in the summer. At those shows, people ask about it. The owner tells the story. He always ends it the same way. 23 children, 7 degrees, 30 feet of ravine, 2.5 hours to the nearest alternative. And a truck that was condemned at 10:15 in the morning and had 23 children back on the road by 8 o'clock at night. The red placard is in the glove box. The current owner keeps it there, not as a trophy, not as proof of anything. Just as a reminder that the distance between what a form can measure and what a man knows is sometimes 30 feet of mountain ravine in a November snowstorm. And that some trucks earn their keep in ways no checklist was ever designed to record.